Today, if you stand on North Lake Shore Drive in Chicago at number 1350, you might think there was never anything remarkable here. The wind from Lake Michigan cuts sharply between concrete towers, the kind you could find in any American city. Glass facades reflect the gray sky. Commuters pass by with headphones in, focused only on the next traffic light. But beneath the pavement, beneath the parking garages and lobby foyers, something once stood here that was so vast, so defiant of its time, it was whispered about as a legend even while it still existed. No plaque marks its place. No bronze relief hints at its story. It has vanished so completely that its absence itself feels like a secret. People who once saw it called it the castle. Not a mansion, not an estate, a castle. Built not on the gentle lawns of privilege, but on sand dunes and swamp, in a part of the city no one dared to invest in. It looked as though it had arrived by accident, ripped from the cliffs of medieval Normandy and dropped, intact and confused, into the rough and rising landscape of industrial America, a place where nothing was quiet and nothing lasted. The building had no front door, at least not in the traditional sense. There were no doorknobs, no knocker, no bell, just smooth oak panels that stared you down. Entry was granted only from within, when a servant received the signal. It wasn't just a gesture of privacy. It was a declaration of power, and that power belonged to a man named Potter Palmer, whose name, today, is mostly known from a hotel and a street sign. But once, he and his wife Bertha built not just a house, but an entire worldview in stone. The strange part is how completely this world disappeared. Usually, when buildings vanish, we find traces, foundation lines, bricks, ornamental ruins, archived blueprints. But here, there is nothing. The only remnants are stories that feel too extravagant to be true. A ballroom the size of a city block. A gallery that once housed paintings now worth hundreds of millions. Fireplaces wide enough for whole tree trunks. And yet, nothing in the current skyline gives the slightest hint of this grandeur. It's as if the earth itself conspired to forget. For decades, this place dominated Chicago's northern shoreline like a fortress keeping watch over the city. It was built to intimidate, to inspire awe, to endure, and it did, for a time. But the silence now is louder than any of its once grand receptions. This is not just the story of a building that was lost. It's the story of what happens when ambition outgrows the world around it. A reminder that even stone, when stacked high enough, begins to tremble under the weight of time. The question is not just why the castle disappeared, but how such a colossal structure, architecturally, culturally, psychologically, was allowed to vanish so quietly. Why did no one stop it? Why does no one today even mention it? What kind of empire must you build for it to be forgotten this completely? Before the bulldozers came, before developers turned the land into faceless high-rises, this was more than a house. It was a thesis, a challenge, a story written in granite and velvet. And if you listen closely, past the wind and sirens, you might still hear its echo, somewhere between the lake and the glass, between the forgotten ambition and the unforgiving progress. He did not arrive with fanfare. No golden lineage, no industrial empire trailing behind him. Potter Palmer stepped into Chicago in 1852 as a quiet man from a quiet faith. A Quaker, raised in the austere rhythms of upstate New York. To his family, extravagance was a flaw, and ambition something to be whispered, not broadcast. But somewhere between the snowy fields of his childhood and the fetid mud of pre-industrial Chicago, something began to shift. He wasn't loud, he wasn't imposing. But his mind, his way of observing the world, was unlike anyone else's. Chicago at the time was hardly a city. It was a fever dream of expansion, a chaos of wooden buildings, overflowing gutters, and sidewalks that collapsed under the weight of their own ambition. The air carried the thick scent of slaughterhouses, and the streets were more obstacle than path. It was the least likely place for a revolution in elegance or commerce. And yet, Palmer looked at it and saw a blank page. His first venture was a haberdashery, not the kind that shouted from storefronts, but one built like a laboratory for ideas. He introduced something scandalous at the time: fixed prices. No bargaining, no shouting matches between buyer and seller. What you saw was what you paid. To many, this was commercial suicide. In a city run by negotiation and distrust, Palmer insisted on clarity, consistency, and something even stranger, trust. Then he pushed further. He added a return policy. If you didn't like what you bought, you could bring it back, refund guaranteed. To his competitors, it was madness. But Palmer wasn't betting on generosity. He was betting on human psychology. He understood that fear was the biggest barrier to purchase. Remove the fear, and you open the floodgates. He wasn't just selling goods. He was reshaping behavior. Women, in particular, responded. In an era when stores treated female customers as distractions rather than clients, Palmer offered something radical: dignity. His store was bright, respectful, orderly, a place where women felt welcomed and valued. They came back, and they brought others. Within a decade, he was no longer just a merchant. He was a force. But behind the Polish, there was something unspoken. He wasn't building an empire out of greed or vanity. There was always a deeper tension behind his calm demeanor. Those who knew him sensed that he was driven not by conquest, but by a profound discomfort with chaos. The world was too messy, too unpredictable. His response was to bring structure, precision, and beauty into it, through commerce, through space, and eventually through stone. By his early 40s, he owned large swaths of State Street and had remade downtown Chicago in his image, cleaner, calmer, more rational. But it wasn't enough. As his fortune grew, so did a peculiar sense of restlessness. He began to look further, beyond business, beyond respectability. He looked to the margins of the map, to the parts of the city people still laughed at: swamps, dunes, insects, a place they called the Frog Pond. And something in him decided that's where the next great structure would rise. Not in the center of power, but far from it. Not on the land blessed by old money, but on dirt no one wanted. To his peers, it made no sense. But Palmer didn't need permission. He didn't build to impress. He built to impose order on the wild. The same instinct that had led him to reimagine retail would now guide his hand in reshaping the very geography of Chicago. He wasn't a robber baron. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't even a natural architect. But in a city drowning in its own noise, Potter Palmer began designing something silent, something enormous and immovable, something that would make the world come to him. No one understood what he was doing. By the 1870s, the social order of Chicago's elite was well established. The city's most powerful families, the Fields, the Pullmans, the Armours, had all planted their flags on Prairie Avenue, a genteel district in the South where carriages rolled over smooth stone and children played behind wrought iron gates. That was where wealth belonged. That was where reputations were maintained and futures carefully inherited. But Potter Palmer, with all his resources and growing status, turned his gaze somewhere else entirely, north toward the damp, undeveloped shorelines of Lake Michigan, toward the windswept emptiness of sand and brush, where mosquitoes swarmed and water pooled in brackish stillness. The locals called it the Frog Pond. Palmer saw something else entirely. He began buying land quietly, acre by acre. The lots were laughably cheap. No one wanted to build there. Why would they? It was inconvenient, undeveloped, inhospitable. The ground was soft, the air heavy with lake moisture. Foundations would sink. Roads didn't yet exist. But to Palmer, it was a blank canvas. And more than that, it was a challenge. It wasn't just about building a home. He had already rebuilt State Street, already transformed downtown commerce. Now he was looking to shape geography itself, to will civilization into existence where no one else saw possibility. People whispered, "He's lost his mind," they said. Who would choose exile over prestige? But Palmer's choice was strategic. By refusing to conform to the tight boundaries of Prairie Avenue, he rejected not just a location, but a system, a closed world of inherited privilege and quiet collusion. In the swamp, he would answer to no one. He would not inherit greatness. He would manufacture it, stone by stone, on ground no one wanted. In this rejection of the expected lay his genius and his madness. Palmer understood something essential, that power does not always grow in the center. Sometimes it grows at the edge, far from supervision, where rules can be rewritten. His move north was not a retreat from society. It was a provocation. He dared the elite to follow him, to reorient the city's gravitational center, and, eventually, they did. But not before mocking, not before doubting, not before dismissing his dream as the indulgence of a man too rich to care what people thought. But he cared, not about gossip, but about vision, about what could rise from nothing. He didn't want a house that fit neatly within Chicago's expectations. He wanted something mythic, untouchable, something future generations would mistake for legend. And to build a legend, first you need a landscape wild enough to accept it. He found that landscape not on polished avenues, but in the broken marshy void where the city gave up trying to make sense. That was the true beginning, not of a house, but of a transformation. In that empty, mocked stretch of shoreline, Palmer saw not a boundary, but an origin. And from that point forward, every decision he made would carry the same defiant message. Greatness is not inherited. It is constructed, precisely where others fear to build. She was only 21 when she stepped into the life of a man twice her age. But from the moment Bertha Honor met Potter Palmer, it was clear that this was no typical arrangement of wealth and beauty, no ordinary alliance between an older magnate and a young socialite. The difference in age, 23 years, was irrelevant to those who saw them together. Something in their presence quieted even the loudest rumors. She was not simply his wife, she was his equal, and soon his counterpart in a project that would outlast them both. Bertha was not from Chicago, but she understood its language better than most. The daughter of a prosperous Kentucky businessman, she had grown up with refinement, education, and a subtle but relentless will. She moved through drawing rooms with grace, but behind the silk dresses and polite smiles was a strategist of the highest order. Where Potter was a visionary of structure and commerce, Bertha was a sculptor of meaning. Together, they weren't just building a marriage, they were constructing a dynasty. And at its center, like a monument to their convergence, stood the idea of a house that would defy everything around it. From the beginning, their union had the texture of something mythic. As a wedding gift, Potter gave Bertha what only a man like him could: a hotel. The Palmer House was to be the crown jewel of the city, a symbol not just of his affection, but of their joint authority. But fate had its own ideas. Just 13 days after the hotel opened its doors, the Great Chicago Fire swept through the city like a punishment. 32 of Palmer's properties were lost. The hotel itself, barely broken in, crumbled into ash and ruin. The city, and their life together, was at a crossroads. Standing over the smoldering remains, Potter was ready to retreat. The loss had hollowed him. He spoke of leaving, of vanishing into the comfort of distant cities. They had enough wealth to disappear. But Bertha said no. Her response, quiet and unyielding, was that they would stay and rebuild. It was not a suggestion, it was a declaration. Her voice, calm and clear, carried more weight than all the noise of loss around them. In that moment, the center of gravity shifted. She wasn't just a partner now, she was a force. From the ashes of the hotel, their legend truly began. They rebuilt State Street, they recast the skyline, but more importantly, they laid the first invisible foundation of what would become their home. Not just a house, not even a mansion, something much more dangerous, a private empire dressed in stone. Bertha was at the heart of its formation. The location had already been chosen, that wind-swept, unwanted edge of the city where Potter had seen potential. But it was Bertha who filled that space with spirit. She saw the house not just as shelter or spectacle, but as narrative. Every room, every hallway, every surface would carry intention, a language of power and grace spoken without words. She would not simply decorate, she would compose, and Potter gave her the freedom to do it. This was their unspoken contract. He would build the fortress, and she would give it life. It was an exchange of realms. He, the architect of the exterior, she, the curator of the interior world. But theirs was not a relationship of competition. It was synthesis. His stone, her silk, his vision, her atmosphere. Their combined will began to carve a space that would come to symbolize not only their names, but an entire moment in American history. A moment when belief, ambition, and aesthetic collided in a single, impossible structure on the shores of Lake Michigan. The night the city burned, it moved like a living thing, Fast, unpredictable, merciless. Flames leapt from rooftop to rooftop, swallowing wood and brick with no regard for wealth or reputation. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 did not discriminate. It consumed homes, businesses, churches, entire streets in hours. And for Potter and Bertha Palmer, it was not just a disaster, it was a complete erasure. They watched as everything they had built, hotels, stores, investments, the foundation of a life meticulously planned, disappeared into smoke. The Palmer House Hotel, the grand wedding gift meant to stand for centuries, stood for barely 2 weeks. 32 of Palmer's buildings were reduced to ash. The fortune he had spent decades assembling seemed to vanish in a single windblown night. And for a man whose identity was so entwined with structure and permanence, the fire struck at something deeper than his portfolio. It dismantled his very belief in control. In the days that followed, Potter walked through the ruins like a man searching for a reason to continue. There was no blueprint for what came next. Chicago was broken. Its skyline, its heartbeat, its future, all scorched. And so was his resolve. He told Bertha that he was ready to leave. They still had money, enough to start over somewhere far from the smoke, far from this cruel rebuke of everything he had tried to build. They could go to New York, to Europe, live quietly, comfortably, without ambition. But Bertha refused. She did not raise her voice, nor did she offer comfort. Instead, she spoke with a clarity that would become legend. It is the duty of every Chicagoan to stay here and rebuild this city anew. That sentence held the weight of 1,000 speeches. It was not a plea, it was a command. And for Palmer, it became a line drawn in the dust and rubble. He crossed it without hesitation. Rebuilding began immediately, but not cautiously. Palmer didn't merely restore what he had lost. He expanded. He doubled down. He secured what was then the largest personal loan in American history, $1.7 million from the Connecticut Mutual Life Insurance Company. At a time when banks were nervous and investors hesitant, Palmer staked everything, his name, his future, his reputation, on the idea that Chicago was not finished. He was not rebuilding a city. He was reclaiming destiny. The Palmer House Hotel was reborn, larger and grander than before. State Street was reconstructed not as it had been, but as Palmer believed it always should have been: wider, cleaner, stronger. Brick replaced timber, iron supports reinforced facades, and beneath all of it, a silent determination. Nothing like this would happen again. But the most dramatic outcome of the fire wasn't downtown. It was the shift in Palmer's imagination. If the hotel was a gift to the city, then what came next would be something else entirely, a gift to no one. A monument to defiance, a structure so absolute in its presence that fire, wind, or time would think twice before touching it. The destruction of 1871 didn't just clear the land, it cleared doubt. The house he had once imagined as a retreat, a place of quiet power on the edge of civilization, now became a mission. He would build not just with stone, but with memory, with the pain of loss and the raw electricity of survival. And Bertha, the woman who refused to run, would become the soul inside that rising fortress. Together, they would create something the fire could not reach, a home that would stare down the city that had once been reduced to ashes and remind it that permanence, if it exists at all, must be earned. It began with the sound of impact, sharp, rhythmic, deliberate. Piles driven into the soggy ground near Lake Michigan, one after another, each strike echoing across the water like the first drumbeat of war. This was not ordinary construction. This was an act of defiance, of will imposed upon nature itself. Potter Palmer wasn't just building a house. He was creating a monument to control in a world that had proved itself dangerously unpredictable, and it started with the ground beneath his feet, unstable, marshy, dismissively called worthless. He would make it carry weight, eternal weight. The foundation had to be deeper, stronger, more complex than any private residence the city had seen. The memory of the fire was still fresh, its destruction still smoldering in Palmer's mind. He didn't want beauty that could burn. He wanted permanence, density, stone that would refuse to move. The architects, Henry Ives Cobb and Charles Sumner Frost, were chosen not for style, but for discipline. Palmer's instructions were clear: no compromise, no delicacy, no facade for the sake of ornament. This was to be a fortress. But a fortress for what? As the base took shape and the walls began to rise, one of the house's strangest features became a subject of whispered fascination. The main doors, massive slabs of hand-carved oak, had no handles, no knockers, no bells, no keyholes, just smooth, solid wood. You could not enter unless someone inside allowed it. No visitor could impose, no neighbor could drop by, no stranger could ring. Entry was not a right. It was a privilege granted by the master of the house. This single detail told a story louder than any architectural flourish. It announced, without a word, that this was not a home for hospitality. It was a domain of exclusion. A space where power flowed inward, not outward, and it introduced a new kind of ritual, one not based on welcome, but on permission. To step into this house was not to visit. It was to be chosen. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. In an age where wealth often flaunted itself through grand staircases, ornate porches, and festive conservatories, Palmer built a facade that dared people to approach. There was no illusion of warmth, no attempt to soften the exterior. The crenellated walls, the looming towers, the narrow slits of windows high above. It was architecture not of invitation, but of dominion. This was not a copy of European castles. It was something stranger, a uniquely American invention born out of paranoia, pride, and post-fire trauma. It looked medieval, but its purpose was modern. It was a house built to keep the world out, a castle designed not for siege warfare, but for psychological defense. A mansion that told the city, "You may surround me, but you will never reach me." As construction advanced, even those who had once mocked Palmer's choice of land began to visit the site, not to admire, but to try to understand. What was this thing taking shape along the shore? Was it a home or a statement? A fortress or a fantasy? They couldn't quite decide, but they felt its presence. Even unfinished, it cast a long shadow. Palmer watched it rise with a calm that masked obsession. Every stone laid into the wall, every beam fixed into place, was a declaration that nothing, not fire, not mockery, not the weight of tradition, would dictate his course. He wasn't just building for safety. He was building a world where he alone controlled who entered and who stayed, where silence in stone held more meaning than conversation or company. And deep inside, beneath the rising towers and behind the handleless doors, the true purpose of the castle began to solidify, not just as a residence, but as a fortress of identity, a place where architecture itself became language, and every inch of that language whispered the same thing. Power is not shown, it is withheld. As the stone walls climbed higher and the silhouette of the castle began to take shape against the cold horizon of Lake Michigan, the murmurs started turning into concern. What had once been a private obsession, one man's eccentric decision to build a medieval fortress on a swamp, was becoming impossible to ignore. The city that had mocked him now had to reckon with him. Chicago, a place of practical minds and industrial ambition, was witnessing something it hadn't prepared for: the reshaping of its geography by the sheer force of one man's vision. At first, the locals called him mad. Real estate agents laughed at the idea of building anything north of the commercial center, let alone a palace. Architects and socialites traded gossip over tea, wondering how long it would take before the structure collapsed back into the marsh it rose from. But when the scaffolding came down, laughter stopped. What stood on the edge of the city was unlike anything Chicago had ever seen, not just in scale or in design, but in presence. It didn't blend in, it reoriented the landscape around it, and people began to notice something more unsettling than the architecture. It was working. Almost by gravitational pull, the very people who had dismissed Palmer's vision began buying up the land surrounding his fortress. Lot by lot, the dunes and thickets were replaced by blueprints and foundations. The same families who had vowed never to leave the comfort of Prairie Avenue were now building summer homes a few blocks away from the castle they once mocked. Palmer, without saying a word, had forced a migration. The center of influence began to tilt north. This shift wasn't just architectural, it was cultural. The area surrounding Palmer's castle transformed into a new elite enclave, not an extension of old Chicago, but the birth of something entirely different, the Gold Coast. A name that once sounded like fantasy soon became real estate gospel, and it all began with one house that refused to follow the rules. What made it so magnetic was not just its scale or cost, but its attitude. The castle did not try to fit in. It made no concessions to local style. It didn't pretend to be polite, and somehow that made it more alluring. In a city full of ambition, here was the purest form of it, raw, unapologetic, armored in granite. The neighborhood changed quickly. Streets were paved. Architects were summoned from the East Coast. New mansions began to rise, some mimicking Palmer's style, others defiantly modern. But all of them owed their existence to his risk. What was once a mosquito-infested wasteland was now the most desirable shoreline in Chicago. Investors who had scoffed at the land's worth now fought over parcels. The transformation was irreversible. But the castle remained different. Even surrounded by wealth, it stood apart. Not just in design, but in meaning. It had not been built to impress the neighbors. It had been built to ignore them. And perhaps that's why it inspired them. The elite didn't want to be invited in. They wanted to be near it, to say they lived in its shadow, that somehow its strength and silence might rub off on them. Potter Palmer never held a press conference. He never lectured, never campaigned. But through stone and silence, he redrew the map of Chicago. His house became more than a home. It was a landmark that didn't need to ask for attention. It simply demanded a response. And the city, despite itself, gave in. To step inside was to enter another world. Past the towering walls and the blank handleless doors, there was no grand announcement, no dramatic fanfare, only silence, but not the emptiness of an abandoned place. This was intentional, cultivated silence, the kind that demanded reverence. The moment you crossed the threshold, the noise of the city vanished, swallowed by the density of the stone, the howl of the lake wind, the clatter of horses, the echoes of carriages, all gone. What remained was stillness, a charged, deliberate stillness that felt like entering a cathedral of power. The central hall rose up 3 full stories, not as a display of height, but of scale. It wasn't just tall, it was overwhelming. An octagonal space beneath a domed skylight of glass, carefully engineered to diffuse daylight into something softer, warmer, like light that had been captured and tamed. In the center stood a fireplace so vast that it could burn full tree trunks without splitting them. Flames crackled not as comfort, but as performance, reminders of what had been lost in 1871 and what would never be allowed to threaten this place again. The floor beneath your feet was Florentine mosaic, every fragment imported from Italy, laid by hand with obsessive precision. Patterns stretched outward like maps to unknown kingdoms, shimmering under the glow of crystal chandeliers that did not flicker. Palmer had electrified the entire house, one of the first in the city to do so. The bulbs themselves were still a novelty, but here they felt like trapped fragments of the sun, embedded into the ceiling. No shadows were permitted to linger. And then you move further. The castle was a labyrinth of 42 rooms, and each one carried its own atmosphere, its own identity. There was no singular style. It was not a house bound by fashion. It was a compendium of tastes, a museum of influences. You turned a corner, and suddenly you were in a drawing room straight out of Versailles. Gilded stucco, silk wallpaper the color of champagne, delicate French furniture that looked as if it would crack under a heavy breath. It was Bertha's creation, a salon of elegance, untouched by time or practicality. A few rooms away, the atmosphere shifted completely. Now you stood in a darkened Moorish smoking room, its walls carved with intricate Eastern patterns, the air thick with tobacco and sandalwood. Here, nothing glimmered. Everything absorbed light. The carpets were so dense they swallowed footsteps. The velvet upholstery, the bronze hookahs, the heavy drapery. It was a chamber built for mystery and negotiation. You didn't speak in this room unless you had something serious to say. Elsewhere, there was the Spanish music room, designed for performances and late-night waltzes. Guitars hung on the walls like relics. A grand piano gleamed beneath a hand-painted ceiling that borrowed from old Andalusian palaces. And then there was the gallery, the castle's beating heart. 75 feet long, lined with crimson velvet, The gallery was not a hallway. It was a universe. Gold frames clung to the walls like constellations. But what they held was even more startling. Monet, Renoir, Degas. At a time when many collectors still laughed at the Impressionists, Bertha Palmer was collecting them in bulk. The blurred, luminous brushstrokes seemed to clash with the Gothic stone architecture, creating a tension that pulled visitors into a visual dialogue. This was not safe art. It was controversial, provocative, modern, and it lived inside a castle that looked like it had survived the Middle Ages. Guests were often invited to dance here. The gallery doubled as a ballroom. Orchestras played beneath Murano glass chandeliers, and the music echoed against canvas and stone. It wasn't just grandeur, it was orchestration. Every square foot of the castle had a function, not just of utility, but of mood. You didn't walk through the house. You were led. And yet, for all its luxury, for all its technical marvels, including the first private elevator in Chicago, the castle didn't feel indulgent. It felt serious, purposeful, like something that had been summoned into existence with too much thought to be merely ornamental. Even Bertha's bedroom, with its bed raised like a throne and its marble bathtub cut from a single block, wasn't soft. It was regal, designed not for comfort, but for stature. What lingered most wasn't the decor or the engineering. It was the sensation that this place was watching you, that every inch of it had been planned not to welcome you, but to study you. The castle didn't want admiration. It wanted to be understood, on its terms, in its language, spoken in silence and stone. It was impossible to reconcile at first glance. The exterior of the house projected an unshakable authority. Brown sandstone walls, fortress-like towers, Gothic crenellations meant to signal permanence and power. From the outside, the castle was medieval, masculine, untouchable. But once you crossed its silent threshold and moved deeper into the rooms, the mood shifted in unpredictable directions. The interior wasn't a continuation of the stone shell, it was a direct challenge to it. The contradictions began almost immediately. You stepped from the echoing silence of the grand hall into a salon that seemed to belong to the court of Louis XVI. Light champagne-colored silk wallpaper, delicately gilded furniture, elaborate plasterwork along the ceiling, each detail designed with precision, a soft breath of French aristocracy placed inside the lungs of a Gothic beast. It wasn't just decoration, it was defiance. Bertha Palmer had no interest in consistency. She wanted contrast. Collision. The room didn't try to match the castle. It tried to offset it. And then, just as your senses adjusted, you passed into another world entirely. The Moorish smoking lounge was a dimly lit cave of carved cedar, jewel-toned textiles, and geometric shadows. Here, Bertha had drawn on Middle Eastern motifs, arched alcoves, mosaic inlays, the scent of cardamom and tobacco heavy in the air. The light fell differently in this room. It was slower, more hesitant. A place designed for secrets, not statements. Men would retreat here after dinner, letting cigars smolder while political deals unfolded behind closed doors. If the French salon was powder and lace, this was burnished metal and slow-burning fire. Nearby, the Spanish music room offered another rupture in atmosphere. It felt less curated, more personal. A mixture of Moorish influence and European grandeur, where deep crimson fabrics lined the walls and lanterns cast a flickering gold glow. The instruments weren't just for show. This was a room that demanded to be heard. Musicians performed under ceilings painted with Mediterranean skies, while dancers moved slowly on parquet floors polished to a mirror. But the greatest aesthetic contradiction, the one that caused hushed arguments among guests and critics alike, waited in the gallery. The castle's main corridor, 75 feet long and lined with velvet, was not adorned with expected portraits of American titans or dusty copies of European masters. Instead, the walls glowed with the shimmer of Impressionism, not diluted reproductions or safe academic works, but original canvases by Claude Monet, Edgar Degas, Pierre-Auguste Renoir. Bertha had collected them not as trophies, but as provocations. At the time, these artists were still divisive, their work dismissed by many as unfinished, blurred, even lazy. To place them in the heart of a Gothic palace was an act of aesthetic rebellion, and yet, somehow it worked. The clash between the dark, heavy stone architecture and the luminous, almost vibrating brushstrokes of Monet's haystacks or Degas' dancers created a visual tension that held the eye hostage. The paintings didn't blend with the space. They pushed back against it. They asked questions the walls couldn't answer. Why place ephemeral light in a room built to last forever? Why choose softness in a house that declared strength? But that was exactly the point. This house was not a monument to taste. It was a negotiation. Between past and future, tradition and experimentation, husband and wife. Palmer, the conservative Quaker, had built a fortress against time. Bertha, the cultural insurgent, had filled it with art that dissolved edges, questioned permanence, and glorified imperfection. The result was not harmony. It was a curated friction. And in that friction, something remarkable emerged. A home that refused to settle. One that contained multiple truths at once. The castle became a stage where Gothic architecture locked eyes with French elegance, where Spanish rhythm echoed off stone vaults, and where Impressionist visions floated against ironclad certainty. It was not beautiful in the conventional sense. It was unresolved, alive, and because of that, unforgettable. The house was never just a residence. From the moment its doors, those infamous handleless slabs of oak, opened for the first time to select guests, it became something more than a home. It was a stage, a meticulously designed environment where every chandelier, every staircase, every carefully curated room served a larger narrative. In an age before cinema, before social media, the Palmers' castle was a living performance, where the elite of the new American aristocracy could enact their roles beneath vaulted ceilings and crystal light. This was not an illusion of grandeur. It was a reality so opulent, so exacting in its beauty, that it eclipsed fiction. The balls were legendary. Guests arrived in carriages that lined the newly paved streets of the Gold Coast, their wheels quiet against the stone, as liveried footmen opened doors. Cloaks were handed off, gloves removed. The air inside was always a few degrees warmer, perfumed, full of the low murmur of strings warming up in the distance. The orchestra played from the far end of the long gallery, just beyond Renoir's glowing sisters and beneath a ceiling of Venetian glass. Bertha herself, dressed in silks imported from Paris, often greeted each guest by name. Her presence was magnetic, not just beautiful, but commanding, as though she had been born for diplomacy. And in many ways, she had been. World leaders, ambassadors, European nobility all passed through those halls. At one such reception, the Spanish Infanta Maria Eulalia of Bourbon wandered the rooms with wide eyes, commenting not just on the paintings, but on the sheer strangeness of the space itself. A Gothic fortress lit by electric bulbs, filled with French lace and modern art. American presidents came not to campaign, but to witness. Senators sought advice here. Opera singers gave private performances in the music room. Industrialists debated the shape of the future over brandy in the smoking lounge. The castle, with all its contradictions, had become the gravitational center of a social galaxy that extended far beyond Chicago. But amidst the glitter, one figure often faded into the shadows. Potter Palmer, the man who had envisioned it all, was rarely the one in the spotlight. While Bertha orchestrated the social calendar, hosted foreign dignitaries, and shaped cultural discourse from her drawing room, Potter retreated to his sanctuary, the library. It was the only room in the house that held on to its original simplicity. Walls lined with books, ledgers, maps, a large desk, a chair that creaked when he leaned into it, no velvet, no gold leaf, just paper and silence. While music echoed through the halls, he worked, he observed. Sometimes he disappeared for hours, unnoticed even by guests who passed just down the corridor. There was no resentment in this arrangement. It was a quiet understanding. Potter had built the setting. Bertha had filled it with life. What mattered most to him was not applause, but control. As long as the house stood, as long as it functioned with the precision he had engineered into its bones, he was content to remain in the background. In fact, that was always part of the design. The castle had never been about him alone. It was about the system he had created, one that could operate without his visible presence, where power didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, unshakable. Still, guests sometimes wondered, In the brief moments when Palmer emerged from the shadows, offered a toast, or nodded in quiet approval, there was a sense of gravity that the chandeliers and musicians could not produce on their own. He didn't need to dance. He had already choreographed the entire evening, and so the castle functioned not as a relic of the past, but as the theater of the future, a place where new rituals of American nobility were tested and refined, where wealth transformed into influence, and influence into myth, where guests left not just entertained, but altered, convinced they had glimpsed something more than luxury, something like legacy, dressed in marble and velvet, lit from within by fire and ambition. As the years passed and the novelty of the castle settled into routine, the grand orchestration that had once filled its halls began to soften. The music still played, the receptions continued, and dignitaries still arrived to marvel at the gallery and toast under the chandeliers. But something had shifted. The laughter seemed more distant, the light more filtered, and somewhere deep within the fortress, its architect began to retreat. Potter Palmer had always been a man of structure, precise, silent, observant, but now, in his 60s, that silence began to grow heavier. The castle that once stood as the triumphant symbol of his vision started to feel like a space he had outgrown, or perhaps one that had outgrown him. The corridors stretched endlessly. The rooms he had designed were filled with people he no longer recognized, voices he no longer followed. The rituals of the house continued, but he moved through them like a shadow, unseen by many, necessary to none. More and more, he disappeared into his library. It remained the one part of the house untouched by Bertha's influence, a sanctuary of discipline amid the velvet and gilded flair. Here, there were no Monet canvases, no imported silks or ceremonial furniture, just rows of ledgers, stacks of correspondence, architectural plans from years past. He kept detailed notes on the house's maintenance, the behavior of guests, the finances of the estate. It was as if he were still running a business, though there was little left to manage. The castle no longer needed him to function. It had become a self-sustaining performance. From time to time, Bertha would stop by, breezing in with news of an upcoming recital or a letter from Europe. She always smiled, always spoke as if the world outside the door was still theirs to shape. But Palmer had stopped shaping. His energy, once volcanic in its quiet momentum, had cooled. He read. He listened to the distant hum of conversation, the echo of his own legacy bouncing through rooms he had built, but rarely entered now. Guests who had once sought his attention now gravitated entirely toward Bertha. She had become the public face of the estate, the embodiment of its elegance, its diplomacy, its influence. Newspapers featured her more often than him. Artists dedicated work to her name. Women across the country admired her style, her intellect, her command of a space that no longer felt like it belonged to her husband. And Palmer, ever the observer, noticed everything. He never complained. There were no outbursts, no protests. That was not his way. But those who had known him in his earlier years, sharp, calculating, always 2 steps ahead, could see the dimming behind his eyes. He had poured his will into this place, carved his identity into every wall, every threshold, and now it moved on without him. Not in betrayal, but in inevitability. The very thing he had built to assert his vision had become too large, too ornate, too vibrant for him to contain. It was filled now with the spirit of someone else, a woman he loved, yes, but whose force had eclipsed even his. The house was no longer an extension of him. It was a monument to something else entirely. In quieter moments, Palmer would sit in the library and stare through the tall windows at the lake beyond. The same lake he had once faced down with ambition and defiance. Now it stared back at him, still and endless, as if asking what had really endured. He rarely ventured upstairs. The great gallery, the tower, the smoking room, all still immaculate, all functioning, but none of them needed his presence. The castle had become his golden cage, a structure too vast for intimacy, too public for privacy, too perfect to change. It preserved his legacy, yes, but it also enclosed it. He had designed it to keep the world out, and in the end, it had kept him in. A man surrounded by beauty he no longer touched, by spaces he no longer inhabited, by guests who danced just out of reach. And though the walls stood strong, unyielding, the one who had built them was slowly fading within them, like a name etched in stone, weathered not by wind, but by time. On a quiet day in 1902, the house finally fell silent in a way it never had before. Potter Palmer, the mind behind the granite walls and the master of the house's original vision, passed away in one of the few rooms that still bore his imprint. It was not in the gallery, not in the ballroom, not even in the grand octagonal hall beneath the glass dome, but in the library, surrounded by ledgers, letters, and the order he had built his life upon. There were no public displays, no grand funeral processions. He had never cared for spectacle. But within the silence, a question emerged that reached far beyond mourning. What happens to an empire when its architect is gone? The answer came quickly, and it wasn't collapse, it was transformation. With Palmer's passing, Bertha stepped forward not just as a widow, but as the undisputed head of one of the most visible and powerful households in the country. For most women of the era, widowhood meant retreat, an expected withdrawal into quiet dignity, often under the watchful eye of male trustees. But Bertha Palmer had no interest in fading. Her husband's will, written with startling simplicity and trust, transferred the entire estate to her without restriction. No conditions, no limitations. In a world where even wealthy women were often treated as custodians rather than owners, Bertha was now in full control. She didn't hesitate. The castle, which had long been seen as a symbol of personal wealth and social display, began to change under her leadership. Bertha kept hosting events, but the tone shifted. Lavish dinners gave way to cultural salons. Receptions welcomed not just dignitaries and industrialists, but artists, intellectuals, suffragists, and reformers. The castle was no longer merely a private residence. It became a platform, a kind of unofficial embassy of American culture, curated by a woman who understood that influence was more powerful when dressed in velvet and spoken in art. She expanded her art collection, doubling down on the impressionists that critics had once ridiculed. While other collectors chased safety in old names, Bertha hunted innovation. She purchased paintings not for prestige, but for what they represented: forward motion. The gallery became a visual manifesto, and her dinners turned into cultural negotiations. Diplomats who had once dismissed her as a hostess now found themselves at tables where policy was shaped alongside dessert. Journalists began to refer to her not as Mrs. Palmer, but as a political force in her own right. And behind it all, the house continued to perform. It was her stage now, no longer split between her and Potter, but fully hers. Every room reflected her values: bold, curated, intelligent. While the world outside debated the role of women, Bertha lived the answer. She oversaw investments, managed vast real estate holdings, and became a pioneer in agricultural development, even acquiring citrus groves in Florida to experiment with new forms of land use. She was not a figurehead. She was an operator. Inside the castle, the servants no longer deferred to Mr. Palmer. The instructions, the decisions, the future, all came from Bertha. And yet, she didn't erase him. His presence remained in the structure, in the rituals, in the rhythm of the house. But now, it moved with her steps. The library still stood, intact, almost untouched, a room preserved in quiet respect. But its door, once closed, now stayed open. In an era when women were still fighting for the right to vote, Bertha Palmer redefined what it meant to wield power. Not in rebellion, but in evolution. She didn't demand permission. She acted as if it had already been granted. The castle, once an expression of a man's dominance over land and legacy, became a living institution of cultural leadership under her command. And while the world watched in disbelief, she carried on, composed, relentless, visionary. The woman who had once stood by her husband during a fire that nearly destroyed everything now stood alone in a fortress that she had quietly reimagined, not as a mausoleum, but as a headquarters, a symbol not of what had been lost, but of what was still being created. Bertha Palmer's reign over the castle was long, elegant, and absolute. She turned it into a monument of culture, a center of power, a cathedral for new ideas. But even visionaries are bound by time. When she passed in 1918, she left behind more than an estate. She left a question that no blueprint could answer. What should be done with a legacy that was built for a world now gone? Her children inherited the house, the collection, the fortune, and the weight of expectation. but the fire that had once fueled their parents did not burn in them. They had grown up surrounded by carved stone, chandeliers, oil portraits, and silence. To them, the castle was not a miracle or a triumph. It was normal, and eventually it became a burden. The world around them was changing. America was entering the Jazz Age, a time of mobility, speed, rebellion, and lightness. New wealth didn't want dark corridors and three-story halls. It wanted penthouses, open floor plans, mirrored elevators, and rooftop terraces. The very things that once signaled power, mass, ornament, ritual, now looked heavy, even suffocating. Maintaining the castle required an army. Taxes had risen, servants demanded higher wages, repairs were constant. The elevator, once cutting edge, became a mechanical headache. And more than anything, the space, so carefully crafted to impress presidents and infantas, no longer fit the life anyone wanted to live. The grandchildren of Potter and Bertha didn't see a monument. They saw an anchor. By the late 1940s, the decision became inevitable. No more renovation, no attempt at preservation, no thought of turning it into a museum or foundation. Just one simple, devastating conclusion. The land was worth more than the house standing on it. And so came the sale. Quiet at first, then public. The press called it the garage sale of the century. Velvet drapes once ordered in Paris were sold for pennies. Gilded chairs that had seated royalty were carted off in the backs of trucks. Chandeliers that had once reflected the first electric light in Chicago were dismantled piece by piece. The fireplace, where full tree trunks had once burned in triumphant warmth, was taken apart brick by brick. No ceremony, no silence. Just the sound of hammers, crates, and distant laughter. Then came February of 1950. Chicago woke to the sound of steel meeting stone. An iron wrecking ball began its slow, rhythmic destruction. The castle did not fall in a storm. It fell in daylight, surrounded by indifference. Each impact rang like a sentence, not just against a building, but against a philosophy. The gallery, where Bertha had hung her impressionists, collapsed into dust. The octagonal hall, once filled with soft light and music, echoed one last time with the crash of shattered glass. The elevator shaft crumpled. The tower came down. The castle had not been defeated by enemies or fire or time. It had been defeated by its own success. Palmer had made the land valuable, too valuable. And now, that same land was being repurposed for progress. 2 high-rise towers of concrete and steel containing 700 standard apartments. No domes, no murals, just square footage and rental yields. But the story didn't end with rubble. Before the demolition, Bertha's most enduring decision quietly took root. Years earlier, she had donated a significant portion of her art collection to the Art Institute of Chicago. The same paintings that once adorned the velvet-lined gallery now hang in museum halls, carefully lit, carefully studied, admired by millions. Monet's haystacks, Renoir's sisters, Degas' dancers, all survived. They escaped the fate of the walls around them. What time could not protect, art preserved. Today, visitors walk through those galleries, unaware that they are, in some strange way, still inside the Palmer Castle. The building is gone, but the dream embedded in its walls lives on in the eyes of those who stop before a canvas and feel something stir. A softness, a memory, a vision. The castle became invisible, but not forgotten. It whispers from the museum's corridors. It lingers in the shape of State Street. It hides in the lines of Bertha's collected letters and the foundations of cultural institutions she helped shape. The lesson it leaves behind is both brutal and beautiful. Granite can crumble, but meaning survives. Walls fall, but what we give, truly give, can outlast everything. In a world now obsessed with digital castles, virtual legacies, and empires made of code, the story of the Palmer Castle stands as a quiet warning. Your towers may reach higher, your glass may shine brighter, but eventually the wind changes. Technology evolves, markets shift, memory fades. What remains is not what you built, but what you inspired, and in that sense, the castle still stands. Not on North Lake Shore Drive, not in photographs or floor plans, but in the permanence of impact, in the simple enduring truth that meaning, once set free, will always find new walls to inhabit.